Greetings everyone, this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be about who are correct teachers of Torah and leaders of Torath Mosheh Jews. So I had been trying to figure out a way to try to do a video like this for a while, and one of the reasons is because I've noticed over the years that there are a lot of people who sometimes get fooled by people who kind of do a lot of internet work. Similar to what I kind of do with the videos I do. I started doing videos a number of years ago just as a kind of a cultural experience thing, especially when I moved to Israel, to kind of show a different picture that people are not really used to. But then I started doing videos probably, I would say, somewhere around like 2000, maybe 2000, I would say probably about 2017 or 18 or so, to kind of deal with a lot of misinformation that I had been noticing around on different, like either like forums like Facebook, different internet video sites like YouTube. And the question sometimes that comes up with people, and sometimes people approach me with it, is about concerning how do you know if you're getting correct information from something or someone, especially about the Torah. The question could be that someone would ask is, well, how do you know you're getting correct information about Judaism? Who has the correct information about Judaism? What about the various branches of Judaism? And one of the things I've had to explain to people is there's no such thing as branches of Judaism. The minute that someone brings something like that up, you would have to say, okay, well, that's not the way that like anyone in the Torah talked. They never talk about branches of anything. And I've covered that in a number of videos, and I've tried to be somewhat indirect about it because there's some people who would find discussing that issue being very offensive. But the other thing too is that there's a number of people who represent themselves a certain way on videos, and some of them I've seen, kind of badmouth anyone who doesn't like hold by the way that they hold by, or that if someone doesn't do exactly what they do, that those people are bad. Now, it's one thing if someone were to say, okay, I'm basing this off of something that goes back thousands of years, that comes from Hashem directly. It's another thing when someone's kind of giving their personal view or opinion, and they're not basing on anything that can be traced back, with any substantial amount of time beyond themselves. Meaning that if you have someone who all of a sudden starts doing videos, no different than what I do, for example, and if I start telling you things, for example, that are my personal opinions and presenting them as if something that, like 1,000 years ago someone held by, without me being able to show like how that's the case, and not only that, being able to show you where I learned it from, and being able to show that I have a mastery of the language it was written in, and that there are other people who, for example, support what I'm saying, then you'd have to say that what I'm talking about is a fraudulent thing. And this can even be in terms of people who present themselves as, leaders in one way or the other. So what I want to kind of do is present in this video who are reliable sources. I was considering kind of showing, who could be considered unreliable, but then you get into a lot of problems trying to actually, go through and identify that. But I think the easier way is to identify what a correct source would be and a correct person would be to learn Torah from, rather than, present like who are the, the incorrect people. And that's, something that stays away from the Lashon Hara aspect of it, but it also presents like, what someone should be looking for. So I think the first step is determining what is the truth, of any matter. What is Torath Mosheh? And that, I think if that's the starting point, it kind of knocks out a lot of people who don't claim to be Torath Mosheh. So let's say you have someone who started some organization within the last like 20 years or so, and you kind of say, okay, well, how do I know that this person is like correct or not correct? It sounds, sounds good, sounds interesting. They seem to be saying some things I like. Well, then you have to kind of say, okay, well, that might be the case in terms of how I feel personally, but is it Torath Mosheh? Do they claim it to be Torath Mosheh? And even if they did claim to be Torath Mosheh, can they prove it based on a Masorah, a chain of transmission that goes back thousands of years? So in previous videos, I discussed exactly what Torath Mosheh is. Essentially, there's two meanings to the statement. One is basically the straightforward meaning of Torah of Moshe, of Moses. The other aspect of it is anything that can be traced back through a chain of transmission to correct information that came from Mount Sinai when the Torah was given by Hashem to the Jewish people, the Israeli people, as well as something that can be traced back through a Mosaic court, a Sanhedrin, a Bet Din Hagadol. And those things are considered to be Torath Mosheh. Now, there are things that don't come through those two issues that are part of a community, tradition that comes out, but again, even those traditions, you have to be able to say, okay, where did we get this from? Is it something that I should follow? Maybe it's incorrect, for example. And the thing is, that's the starting point. So if something can't be proven to be Torath Mosheh, you can basically disregard it. But again, this is something that person has to work through and know what Torath Mosheh is. And I kind of will be giving some tools about that in just a second in terms of learning who are correct people to be learning from for that information. So in terms of what a Torath Mosheh source of information is, we talked about this in a previous video, that it's something that's ancient, authentic, and authoritative. We'll get into this at the end of the video also, but essentially if something can be proven to be ancient, authentic, and authoritative, then through a certain track, chain of transmission, then you could say that that source is Torath Mosheh. But again, we have to be very specific on who we're learning that from. So in a previous video, we had already went through and related to the issue that there's never been a situation where, all the Jewish communities around the world, have had a huge lapse in keeping the Torah. There's always been Jewish communities somewhere in the world that are keeping Torah correctly. So that being the case, we should be able to know that in every generation you can find Torath Mosheh Jewish communities, from the time the Torah was given until now. So one of the best ways, I would say, to be able to identify exactly when we say, someone who is a correct teacher of the Torah, a leader of a Jewish community, anything that they say and do should be able to be taken through that chain of transmission that I mentioned earlier. That essentially, if you're looking at that chain of transmission, the starting point you could say is, okay, if I'm looking at a community, where are they from? What locations are they from and how old are those communities? If I find out that, for example, there's a particular congregation or a synagogue or a bet Knesset that I go to, and anything they present are the leaders of those communities, or basically people who are the oldest people in the community, their communities don't go back that far. Let's say I showed up in a synagogue and I find out that their particular, if you will, branch of Judaism, so to speak, has only been around for, like, let's say 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, I can write them off as being someone I'd want to learn Torah from, because again, they'd have to be able to show me that what they're talking about, is something that goes across the board. It's authentic and authoritative, but it's also ancient. And these are the list of the most ancient Jewish communities that can trace themselves back in the way back. And again, you want to avoid what you see at the bottom of any group that has unclear origins based on an exile alone, or any group that's a breakaway movement. And essentially what you'd be looking at is, going with the first one, is if you have a group of people who kind of start up a Jewish community somewhere and claim to be like the most ancient, but then you look at them and say, okay, well, how far back does this go? Do your parents hold by this? Do you have, like, who are your leaders like 500 years ago? Who are your leaders 600 years ago? Where are the writings that they have? And these are the things you should be asking or looking at first and foremost. So another important aspect, when you see people on the internet, posting videos, or, you see people doing presentations, lectures, and they're presenting these, ideas, first question, another question you have to ask is, well, who did they learn from? Who were the people that taught them? If someone claims to be a rabbi, for example, who, gave them smicha, who gave them ordination? Now again, the process of ordination anciently is not exactly like it is today. It's not like at one point you go to a university, things like that. But what you're looking for is, if someone says, I'm a rabbi, the first question is, okay, well, who did you learn from to start with? How long were you learning with those people? And then the second thing is, who, gave you, authority to basically, have the title rabbi and things like that. Now, what that means is that, generally speaking, for someone to be, officially a rabbi, there'd have to be another rabbi who either writes them a letter, saying, okay, this person has learned from me. I, state that this person, has been given what's called smicha by me. And essentially, they should be able to identify those people, like, pretty easily. It shouldn't be a situation where they don't want to, like, tell you who those people are, because again, if they don't want to tell you who, gave them smicha, that seems kind of strange on some level. And it could be that they don't want you going back to those people to identify exactly what it is they got. Now, the other side of that is, if they got some kind of, like, let's say, ordination or some degree from someone who themselves is not very well known, someone who themselves doesn't have a chain of transmission going back to ancient times. Well, again, you'd have to kind of, like, weigh that and say, okay, I don't know if this is somebody I should be learning from. Maybe I should learn from someone else who actually has the credentials to take me back several thousand years, who, actually comes from a family that has kept Torah, whose parents and grandparents and great-grandparents kept Torah, and that they have learned from the most well-respected people, in the Jewish community, going way back. And if not, then you may have to take everything they say with a grain of salt. So as an example, one of the things, I was watching a video of this one rabbi who was doing a lot of kiruv work, meaning drawing Jews back to the Torah here in Israel. And someone asked him, like, how do you know who's like giving, the correct information in terms of, the rabbis, and basically what this rabbi was saying was like, in every Jewish community, everybody knows who the most intellectual and most knowledgeable and the most upright, leaders of the community are. Everybody knows that. So it doesn't matter if you're talking about the Yemenite Jews, the Moroccan Jews, the Sephardic Jews, Ashkenazi Jews. Everybody knows who's a respectable leader of those communities, who's a respectable teacher of the Torah in those communities, a respectable rabbi. Everybody knows who that is. If you come to Israel, you don't have to ask, and someone says, I don't really know who our leaders are. Every community knows who the most respected leaders of those communities are. And if you have a situation where you have someone like claiming to be a leader, especially on the internet, and that's one of the things that's important to say, that especially on the internet, you would think with all the information that's there that people would be able to like easily find out, okay, who's a reliable source, but it's not always that, the case, especially, if someone doesn't know. If you're not a part of a Jewish community, often you don't know who the most respected leaders are. But, what you see here are pictures of some of the most respected leaders here in Israel, in the past and the present, and even before the state of Israel, in certain communities, who were the most respected individuals of those communities. And essentially, if, their name is on something, you can easily say, okay, I can put a large degree of trust in what's here. Where if it's someone else who has no connection to any of these communities, any of these leaders, you may not want to put a lot of trust in that. So then the other question is, okay, does this person have a mastery of the language? For example, someone saying that they're a rabbi, and then you say, okay, well, can you read this Hebrew text and tell me what it means? And then if I go back and back check what you're saying, does it come out to be true? If you have someone who can barely read Hebrew, who can barely expound upon what's there and show you where they got that information and where they got that understanding from, and show you others who agree with their understanding, essentially you may want to like question them, basically, and say, okay, well, not even question, just maybe even ignore them, and find yourself someone who has a mastery of these languages. And there are rabbis, for example, even outside of Israel, who are fluent in Hebrew. Even if they don't speak it as a language, they can read through a text and tell you exactly where they got it from. But then, you also would want to say, okay, well, maybe I should find someone who's fluent in the language, both in speaking and in reading and writing, so that I can like learn from someone who has mastered it, rather than someone who's like, as they call a Johnny come lately. Someone, it'd be like using me as an example. I mean, often in my videos I try to present ancient sources, but that's not to try to say someone should follow me. I mean, really, the way I do these videos, my idea is that, I try to present information that a person can go back and research themselves, and then if a person is like either Jewish or not, and they're looking to try to connect themselves to a community, that way that they have some basis that they can start with. But the videos I do are not for like to make final decisions off of. That's, the last thing I would want someone to do based on a video I make. I would want someone to be able to know what the sources are and be able to show them, okay, these are ancient sources. You can easily learn them for yourselves. It takes time. It takes, experience. It takes, a certain level of strength to be able to go through and say, I'm going to learn a language, get fluent in it, and then be able to read ancient sources. But generally speaking, you should be looking for someone who can take you through this process, take you through these texts. And, the thing is, what's important is that comes from being in a community, not specifically from being on the internet. I've had people contact me, and one person, for example, wanted me to teach them Hebrew. And I'm like, I live in a different country. I can't teach you Hebrew. I don't have time. I have a family I'm trying to like raise here in Israel. So the other thing is that if you're not a part of a community locally, it's going to be very difficult to try to survive without the ability to be local to a community. So that's the thing that's important here, is that having someone who knows the textual history and the nuances is a very key person to latch onto. But again, someone who's just kind of like posting videos and doing things like that, that's not always where you want to go. It might be a good start to kind of get your foot in, feet in the water, so to speak, but it's not someone that you want to like try to rely on very heavily. So in conclusion, The important aspect of what we were saying was, concerning like people who are leaders, as well as teachers of the Torah in the Torath Mosheh Jewish community, who's reliable. So my hope is that in this video you've been able to identify the things that I personally consider to be what a person should be looking for in terms of what's reliable. So essentially, when dealing with the requirements, again, you want to look for something that's ancient, authentic, and authoritative. And that includes people, who are the leaders. If someone who can show you how what they're talking about is ancient, authentic, and authoritative, then it's someone you can listen to. But again, you have to be able to test these things, so you have to be able to test, okay, if I, bring this up, what kind of attitude does the person have? I've actually came across someone once who was basically purporting themselves to be a leader, of, something. I mean, they didn't really claim to be a leader of a community, but they didn't like being challenged. They didn't like having someone say, okay, well, that doesn't sound right what you're saying. I've looked in the text is this. They also didn't use the most authoritative text. So for example, they put out a text that, by most people is not considered to be authoritative. Then there are some people who are not authentic, in terms of being leaders. And again, that's why I say that you have to be able to look through and say, okay, well, what qualities does this person have? And I would again express that if you go through and say, okay, well, does this person, was what they're saying, can it be traced back through something that I can check for myself in the languages it was given in? If this person is out there teaching something, would someone who's Israeli, someone who knows Hebrew fluently, would they listen to them? Would someone who, was a leader in Israel who was like older listen to them? So if you have some person out there who's maybe like, let's say in their 20s, teaching some stuff on the internet or saying these things, and you look and say, okay, that doesn't sound right, or it's questionable whether it's right. Let me take that to like, a person who grew up in the Jewish community, who grew up living by the Torah, and whose family member has a long history of it, and who's like, let's say maybe 80 years old. Let me see if they agree with what this person's saying. And the other thing I would say is you have to be careful of people who make it seem as if they're the only ones keeping things correctly. So you have some people out there who make it seem as if everyone else is wrong except for them. And that they're only people out there. Now, again, if they can prove through a chain of transmission what they're doing is like ancient and authentic and authoritative, then okay, you may have something to rely upon. But obviously, the way the Torah, was given by Hashem, they wouldn't be the only people. There would be others out there besides them. So again, it's one thing if we say, okay, well, the only people who keep the Torah correctly are Torath Mosheh Jews and Orthodox Jews. That's a claim that we can actually historically go back and see why we can say that. But if you have one individual who's saying, well, I'm the only one keeping it correctly and nobody else is, you may want to question that very, very thoroughly, because it doesn't work that way. Now, Hashem would never create a situation where there's only one individual who's keeping the Torah correctly and no one else is. And just to close, you can basically look at, there's a story in the Tanakh about Eliyahu HaNavi. Now, Eliyahu HaNavi was in a situation where he had to stand up against the governmental, establishment in the northern kingdom of Israel, who was led by Ahav at that time. And essentially, at one point, when he had stood up to that, situation, he felt like he was by himself, and he was basically telling Hashem that, hey, I'm tired of this, I'm by myself. And one thing Hashem told him was like, there's like several thousand guys you haven't done the Avodah Zarah, or the, if you will, the idolatry that was being done. There's about 7,000 guys out there, not just you. So essentially we know that in every generation there's going to be a number of Jews who are keeping the Torah correctly, and it's never going to be one situation where from the time the Torah was given till now where there's only like one person doing correctly and no one else is. Even prior to the Torah being given, that was never the situation. So this is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and I hope this video helps. Take care.